Hello. So this week, just back to me, no special guest this time, and I'll be talking about North Star metrics and more, North Star metrics for growth. How do we use them, and how do we actually get the team working behind them? Because they are super, super important. I would say crucial to actually driving sustainable success to an account. And you'll often find that without a North Star metric, you can not only, not grow, but often you'll be kind of moving around and trying to figure out, exactly what you should be targeting with each of those campaigns. So if you get a sense that your team or your a product or anything driving delivery of a product or a client, for example, if you're really struggling for direction within there, the North Star metric aims to do exactly this and fix that kind of a situation. So we'll start off with the definition of a North Star metric. And to be honest, I've never seen this framed any better than Amplitude's guide to North Star metrics. This is a kind of quick overview of it. It's really worth it. I'll drop it in the links and the comments, for example. But this is a really good way of framing exactly what that metric is. And Amplitude really defined this as being, and I'll quote from the article here, it's a single metric that best captures the core value that your product delivers to its customers. Now, Amplitude are thinking of this more in a sense of, how do product teams get behind a North Star metric? But how do we reframe that for a growth sense? What's a growth North Star metric? And really, the growth North Star metric is the KPI which shows the core value that your program delivers to the bottom line. So rather than the core value that your product delivers to the customers, it's basically, our program is the product, our customer is the bottom line. What is the thing that leads to the greatest impact and the greatest objective value on the bottom line? And I think you can kind of sense check whether or not something is a good growth star metric by the simple test of, if you see this metric improve, do you 100% see sustainable increase in revenue? And if it doesn't pass that check, then it is not a North Star metric. And I'll give a few examples a bit later on of exactly what form bad North Star metrics and that kind of fail this test along the way. So we'll start off with really why North Star metrics are crucial. And I think, in some senses it's really obvious, but in other senses, these benefits might not necessarily be so clear. So first of all, and specifically for growth teams, you don't ever really want to change, or you don't unnecessarily want to change the goalposts, or you want to change the goalposts as little as possible. You want to have a sustainable target across month to month, across year to year, ideally, that you can use to measure success, and that you can set, for example, an agency to go away and maximize. This is one of the kind of clearest breakdowns that I've seen whenever it comes to especially client agency relationships, or when working with freelancers, for example, is that often it's because the two aren't necessarily working together towards the same goal. And once you fix those two things, then you get everyone working in tandem. So it's one that you can use as long as you are measuring to it consistently. It's one that you can actually start to go, okay, what is our year-on-year impact? What is our month-on-month impact? What are we aiming for on the daily? Secondly, a clear benefit of it is that it obviously focuses on the things that drive ultimate growth. And I'll come on to exactly why this is later on. Thirdly, it helps you to frame everything. So unless you know what metric you ultimately want to improve, you kind of find yourselves optimizing towards kind of a lot of different metrics across the board that don't necessarily all unite. And I think a really clear example of this is in, for example, creative testing, where if you lack that ultimate KPI or a North Star metric that is kind of meaningful, that has enough quantity, for example, then you find yourself running creative tests often enough on proxy metrics that don't really, tell you how good a creative is. So this is where you focus on metrics like click-through rate, for example, and click-through rate is great. You want to ideally see that as high as possible for an ad, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. If I slapped a giant, lots of free stuff on an ad, I'd get an amazing click-through rate, but I wouldn't necessarily get the greatest amount of revenue from that particular ad. So it really helps us to focus basically everything on the right track. Now, fourthly, if you kind of have a proper quality North Star metric across the board, it ultimately means that you not only track how you're resonating with people, and I think that click-through rate is a really good example of that. That tracks how you resonate with people, but it doesn't show you how you specifically resonate with your target audience. If you don't have a good North Star metric, then you basically are at a loss for how you are driving impact for your target user. And then finally, instrumentation. So if there's one thing that's changing across every single platform at the moment, is that all of them are becoming increasingly black boxes where you set things up, you give it a metric to improve, and then you tell the platform to go away and improve that. And there are very few clearer examples of this than a product like Google Performance Max. Meta is another example. Meta's always been kind of the same way. But more and more for Google Performance Max, it will go away and it will maximize the thing that you tell it to. So you want to make sure that the thing that you tell it to maximize actually represents long-term sustainable revenue for you. So all of those reasons why it's important is the fact that we have clear goalposts. It lets us focus on the things that drive ultimate growth. It helps you to frame everything, whether it be creative testing around the same area. Fourthly, it lets you track how you are resonating with your target audience specifically, rather than all users. And then fifthly, you can actually use it very, very helpfully within instrumentation within your platforms. Although, you don't necessarily, a North Star metric doesn't necessarily have to be instrumentable. So for all of these factors, that North Star metric is incredibly crucial to pretty much everything. And I'd say no more so than actually just getting a team focused behind one clear goal and working towards it. So now that we've kind of seen the importance of it, we can chat a little bit about how do we find a North Star metric? What does it have to be? What are you looking for in this kind of a goal? Now, first of all, and the Amplitude Guide is actually really good for framing this at a product level, but let's kind of translate that to a growth level. Now, a North Star metric, firstly, it has to correlate with revenue. It doesn't necessarily have to represent revenue. Revenue might be something that happens far down the line for you, for example, but it has to correlate directly with revenue. So a good example of this is that leads don't represent revenue, but wins do represent revenue. A really kind of clear sign of this is, and this goes back to that sense check that I said earlier. If you remember, it was if you see this metric improve, then will you see revenue increase ultimately down the line? And leads don't pass that check. If you increase the number of leads that you have, it won't necessarily represent revenue because you might have bad quality leads. You might have, if you increase leads, you might have open yourself up to a lot of bots, for example, a lot of foul players, all of that kind of thing. So by increasing leads, you might not necessarily increase revenue. In fact, in some occasions, I've seen increasing leads reduce revenue because the sales team, for example, can't cope with the sheer quantity of leads that are coming through. So the first key thing that we have to get from our North Star metric is that it correlates with revenue. Secondly, and I kind of spoke a little bit about this earlier, a North Star metric has to be a leading indicator. It can't be a lagging indicator. So we can't, for example, it's pretty useless for us to have a North Star metric that we only find out how we did about 2 months down the line or a month down the line, for example. It's one that we have to, and it has to occur sooner rather than later. It's one that ideally we want to know within a week whether the thing that we did had an impact on it, for example. So, for example, in many B2B situations, wins are something that happen well down the line. Your buying journey might be 9 months, it might be a month, it might, whatever it is. We cannot wait that long, for example, in a lot of scenarios in order to tell whether something has had an impact on that figure. If we only find out about it in 9 months' time, that's kind of useless to us. Thirdly, a North Star metric has to be clearly defined. And this is pretty kind of key. It has to be easily understandable by everyone involved. If you are going to get a whole team working behind it, it has to be something that is clearly defined, A, so that everyone comprehends it, but also so that B, people don't kind of accidentally measure it incorrectly. You could have a really complicated North Star metric, but unless you have like absolute lockstep around how to calculate that, or you have a view that clearly shows it and lets people apply it to their work, then people will probably, miscalculate that, and they'll start to kind of use other figures as a proxy for that metric because they just don't understand it, for example. So it has to be clearly defined. It has to be both clear and clearly defined. And being clear helps it be clearly defined. Fourthly, it has to be relevant. So for everyone, obviously for everyone involved, it's useless to set a North Star metric that you can't have an impact on. So we can't, for example, say that our North Star metric is, let's say, overall business revenue, because or overall business profit, for example, because there are so many things that are out of our hands when it comes to that. It has to be something that is relevant specifically to our work, that, if we do a good job, we know that we can increase that particular metric. And then finally, it has to be quantitative and it has to be objective. So it has to be a solid figure. We can't just say kind of generally, we want to increase customer satisfaction, for example. It has to be something that, how do you define that? Is it our net promoter score, for example? Is it the percentage of positive reviews that we have across the board? You can't just set something that's very qualitative, that's illy defined, that no one can really track. You have to make it quantitative, and that helps with the clear one as well. So I'd say if the key ones within there, it's the correlating with revenue that is the one that I see most people kind of falling down on. And I think a really clear way of showing this and the difference between a good North Star metric and a bad North Star metric is just to take you through a couple of examples of what would be good North Star metrics versus what would be bad. So rather than, for example, our leads KPI, where we know that increasing leads won't necessarily lead to increased revenue, but if we change that to the number of qualified leads, again, it's qualified is something that is at the discretion of a sales team, for example. But this is a really good one for B2B, is that as long as you can get a fairly consistent view of what is a qualified lead, for example, if it hits a certain number of criteria, or at least as long as that view is judged by one person who's going to stay consistent over time, then qualified leads is a really good metric to run towards. If we know that we blanket win, let's say 50% of those qualified leads, then we know that if we increase qualified leads, we're going to increase our ultimate revenue. That also fits because we can tell pretty quickly whether a lead is qualified or not, for example. That's something that we're going to do within a week rather than within 9 months, for example. Another really good one is revenue. So obviously revenue is something that very clearly correlates with ultimate revenue. But in many occasions, in a platform sense, for example, increasing revenue, let's say through the metapixel, if you go after blanket revenue within a platform, it won't necessarily directly correlate with ultimate business revenue. So this is a little bit of a tricky one where we might define revenue slightly differently in order to have an impact. So there are many reasons why revenue in a platform might not correlate with ultimate incremental business revenue. It could be, for example, on a channel like Meta, if you're hitting, many of the people who would have converted anyway, for example. It could be that you have a good batch of returning customers that come through. You're pretty you're pretty likely to recapture those customers kind of time and again without the support of any of those channels. So actually, you could focus on new customer revenue or first-time purchaser revenue from a particular channel. So this is a weird one where it's not necessarily, if you're an e-com business, the North Star metric might not just be revenue, and you might find that everything you do whilst you're setting up the channels, for example, and you're seeing in-channel revenue going up week by week, it might not necessarily translate into longer-term growth. So this is one that you have to ultimately look at what is a better North Star metric there. Finally, a really good example within particularly SaaS businesses is who often have, or consumer businesses that have a trial period, for example. The a really With that trial period, we introduce an element of lag, which is something that we really don't want within a North Star metric. If you have like a 1 month trial, for example, then we don't want to necessarily wait for a month before we see the fruits of our labor, before we are able to judge anything that we do. So within a trial period, you want to take a look at, is there any information that you can get about users that indicates how likely they are to convert from that trial, whether it be actual use of the product within the trial period, for example, whether it be that you just see a particular demographic or a particular group or whatever, who are more likely to convert at the end of their trial, then you could use that as a leading indicator where, for example, you could set your North Star metric as cost per qualified trialist, for example. And that's going to be much more useful and a much clearer metric that all teams can really get behind in the acquisition stage to maximize those events. I think it's worth leaving off with, a North Star metric isn't necessarily something that you can optimize towards at a channel level. They sometimes can't be instrumented. For example, there might be just a number of blockers that stop you from importing that data in and really optimizing towards it effectively. But in all occasions, you want to set things up so that is the ultimate goal. And as soon as we've set up our North Star metric, we can actually start breaking it down into sub-metrics. What are the things within that are going to increase the North Star metric itself, which is going to increase ultimate revenue. And that's where we can start to break it down and on a channel by channel level, figure out what are the things that this channel can impact or influence that is going to increase our North Star metric. So the North Star metric across email marketing, for example, versus paid media versus organic might look very, very different. But ultimately, each of those will have a part to play, where organic might be to get traffic to a certain metric. But we don't want to just follow kind of focus on traffic. We want to say, okay, prioritize any sort of traffic that looks like it's skewing to this thing that we want to increase. And on the flip side, email marketing, for example, they operate at a completely different level of the customer journey within here, where, for example, we have qualified trialists already through. And if we can increase the number of qualified trialists that convert to ultimate subscription, that's much better, a much clearer goal than, for example, just focusing on all trialists. If that puts it at the mercy of, for example, if we see a reduction in the quality of trialists, then conversion rates from email are going to reduce. Whereas if we're just focusing on qualified trialists in the first place, we have a very clear vision of how our efforts are doing, of how the changes that we're making are impacting the users that we most want to convert, and this very stable definition of a group that we know is qualified and therefore that we can drive them towards conversion. So this is what I mean by how important North Star metrics are and how important it is to have a team working clearly around them. And you can kind of see through a lot of the examples that I've given, the pitfalls that you can fall into along the way, whether it be, optimizing towards impressions, for example, towards just a metric that doesn't really make sense, where you're just kind of in this death loop of maximizing something, but it doesn't really have an impact on your business. And you just kind of go in loop of, why does nothing we do actually impact the bottom line, for example? Whereas if you get all of these stages right and select a North Star metric that actually correlates and is meaningful towards long-term, sustainable, incremental revenue, then you've done a lot of the work already. And that is something very clear that you can brief out to all of your teams, to agencies that you work with, for example. Or if you're an agency, it could be something that you recommend to a client that goes, actually tasks yourself to something that will have a bottom line impact. And if you have this, you can work together, you can drive growth and sustainable incremental growth. But it's also just going to make everyone's lives a lot more easy to have a very clear goal that all of you are working along the way. So I hope that's been useful. We've chatted about why North Star metrics are so important. We've talked about how you go about finding a North Star metric, and we've run through a lot of the pitfalls and dangers of, what are bad North Star metrics and what are good ones that can help you along the way to finding that. And that's it for today. There'll be another one next week. I hope to have a guest. I've got a few nice ones lined up again. And I'll be talking more in the future about vertical video, for example. I've got a big piece coming out on that, which I'm very excited to share. So yeah, join me later on and see you in a bit.